I could go back in time and change anything about my daughter's life, like this would be it. And I'm only saying that because hindsight is 2020. At the time, we made every decision just out of our love and also seeking the advice from medical professionals. But this is the one thing that I just feel like I'm hard on myself about. And I think it's because it just replays in my brain so often. And I wish it didn't. All of this has to do with the first feeding tube that we got Poppy. Right after we got her diagnosis, our pediatrician was doing a lot of research. And he said, you know what? Like, Poppy's feeding issues are not going to get better. I think we should start planning for a feeding tube sooner than later, which we really appreciated because all of that takes a while. We had to go meet with a gastroenterologist, a stomach doctor, and that doctor then set us up with a surgeon. So with those two medical professionals, we came up with a game plan. There were 3 things we were going to do in this feeding tube surgery. The first one is we wanted to tighten the top of her esophagus. Wait, is that what it is? Wherever the stomach connects to the throat. I don't know what that is. Anyways, they wanted to tighten that, make the hole smaller so that the acid reflux wouldn't bother Poppy so much. The second one is we were just going to put in a stomach feeding tube. And then the third one, they weren't sure if they needed to do this one or not. Open up. So we were going to tighten the top of the stomach and maybe open up the bottom of the stomach so that her food could flow into the intestines more easily. But that's a really risky thing to do. So they did not want to do that unless we needed to. Again, before we could do surgery, we had to do a couple tests to make sure Poppy needed all of this stuff. Very evident she had acid reflux, but in like the stomach study we did, they found that her stomach was pushing food into the intestines. It was kind of slow, but it definitely wasn't necessary at that point. This will be important later, I promise. But so when it came time to do the surgery, we just did the first 2 things. Just to understand my mindset, like I was pretty desperate at this point for some help. Like Poppy probably needed this feeding tube sooner, but like we had been so diligent with feeding her and keeping up with that she did okay. Besides the pain of the acid reflux. That was the main reason I wanted her to have this surgery, is because I knew she was in pain with the acid reflux. So anyways, we went into the surgery. We had heard really positive things about this surgery. Again, I think it's a pretty like easy one for kids, but it wasn't for Poppy. So, you know, you like pass off your child before surgery and they take him back. And then when it was time for us to go back and see her like in the recovery area, walking up to her, my husband and I were just both like in tears. Like, I don't know, just seeing her in a little medical bed with a little hole in her tummy, it was just sad. Even though we knew it was like the right thing for her, it was still just so hard to see that in your child. We knew she would have to stay overnight just to be monitored, again, coming off that anesthesia. And we had to learn how to do feeding tube stuff as parents. I remember walking into the room, there was a quilt. Oh, this one. This quilt laying on a crib bed along with this little stuffy, and that was just such a nice little like bright moment in the room. It was right before Valentine's Day. Anyways, Poppy was in a crib style bed, you know, with her little blankets, and that wasn't gonna work for me. I wanted to be with Poppy, so I immediately, while she was still like recovering and asleep and just resting, I asked our nurses, I was like, can we switch out her bed to be an adult size bed so that we can lay with Poppy? They were super hesitant about that. For good reason, you know, they were like, we don't normally do that with kids her age because if she rolls out of the bed, that is a huge liability. And we told them, like, you guys, Poppy has never rolled a day in her life. Like, if she rolled out of bed, that would be not only a miracle, but we'd probably be like cheering her on, you know what I mean? So anyways, after they understood, they brought us a bed so we could lay with Poppy. Once Poppy started waking up, it was very evident how uncomfortable she was and how much pain she was in. So immediately my husband and I were like, oh, grab the pacifier, because again, this girl's pacifier queen. That was like her favorite thing in the world. And she wouldn't take her pacifier, which is something that always soothed her. For the next 3 days, we would constantly be trying to give her her pacifier. And from that point on, for the rest of her life, she never took a pacifier again or was able to suck. That might seem like minuscule, seeing as now she had like a feeding tube. She didn't need to suck, but like her pacifier was her security blanket. It was like her version of a special stuffed animal. You know, everywhere we went, we had 2 pacifiers with us because that was just the way she soothed herself, and it was her comfort. And so I feel like this surgery took away one of her favorite things, her pacifier. But the other thing that made her really uncomfortable is we did an EEG while we were in the hospital. So Poppy had all of the electrodes connected to her head and they were looking for seizure activity. They had to monitor that for about like 12 to 24 hours. And so they just had decided to check for seizures while she was already in the hospital for this surgery, kind of do two things at once. They were trying to get her started on her feeds. So we had her formula being like pumped into the stomach, and she was so uncomfortable. She was on a bunch of different pain meds. She was like really using her lungs, and it just wasn't getting better. They had told us, like, we can't have you guys leave the hospital until Poppy's able to take, I don't know what it was, like a certain amount. Let's just say it was like 40 milliliters of liquid an hour into her stomach. And you guys, she was at like 5. It just wasn't working. It just wasn't working. After being there for 3 days, we had to get so many different permissions to leave the hospital. They just didn't want to discharge her, but we wanted her home. And again, we were like, you guys, I promise you, we're smart, logical parents. Like, we will monitor her feeds. We will slowly increase them as, her stomach heals and does better. And we also were paired up with a dietitian who would come into our home. So eventually, after 3 days of, it was just horrible. It was like so horrible. Anyways, that recovery was so hard. After like 3 days of being in the hospital, my husband sleeping on the couch, I slept on the bed with Poppy. We got to go home, and putting Poppy in her car seat after her being stuck in that bed with the electrodes and just sweat from crying. Oh my gosh, you guys, she was just so happy to be in that car seat and headed home. She was so happy. Once we got home and we're pumping food into Poppy's stomach 24/7, like we couldn't stop because such little amount of food was going into her stomach each hour that we had to run her feeding tube 24/7. We took it everywhere with us. It just never got better. And that's where I say I have regrets about this. I don't want to scare any parents by saying this. Every decision you make about your child should be with your medical provider. Poppy was so rare, this genetic mutation. Like, no one really knew exactly what was going on in her body. But what I witnessed as a mom is both times that Poppy was put under anesthesia, she had huge steps of regression backwards. The first time she had anesthesia with the MRI, she was never able to nurse after that. We had to use a bottle, and it was so difficult. And then after this second time with the anesthesia, she would never suck again. She wouldn't take her pacifier, and her stomach became paralyzed. So the reason that we weren't able to pump food into her stomach and she was uncomfortable is because the food wasn't then moving into her intestines. Her body was not working properly. After getting that feeding tube, she did not gain weight. She lost weight. And sometimes my mind flashes back and just worries that she felt hungry. I don't know. But I don't know if she did. I don't know if she felt hungry because she had food in her stomach. It's just her body wasn't getting the nutrients. It was emptying so slow because, again, her stomach was paralyzed. We attempted this first feeding tube for a whole 3 weeks, which, again, looking back, was way too long. And we finally went back into the gastroenterologist, the stomach doctor, to see him. Poppy had lost, I think, a whole pound. I think she was 15 pounds at this point, and she was over a year old. And immediately, it was decided that she needed a second feeding tube. She needed one that would go past her stomach straight into the intestines. And the only way to do that was to go through her nose, down her throat, through the stomach, and into the intestines. That's what we did. And that always had to be placed in a hospital under an x-ray machine. So if it ever got pulled out, we had to go to the children's hospital and they had to replace it so it perfectly positioned into the intestines. It's hard. I just look back and I think about her level of comfort because it's like, I know for a fact, like nothing truly would have like saved her, because of her genetic mutation. But